welcome to this session on editorial media and big tech. My name is Helle Sjøvåg. I will be chairing this session today. I'm a professor of journalism at the University of Stavanger here in Norway. And my research currently is about the material conditions for distribution of media content. And editorial media are, as you know, responsible for overseeing power and for providing an arena for democratic conversation. So here in Norway, it's the responsibility of the state to ensure that the infrastructure for information, communication and expression is open, diverse and free to all. This responsibility is in fact embedded in paragraph 100 of the Norwegian Constitution on freedom of expression. So media used to largely own distribution infrastructures in the past. They owned the television towers that relayed broadcasting signals, the trucks that delivered newspapers, and they leased the bandwidth where radio signals were transmitted. But they have also always been somewhat reliant on third parties to get their content out to audiences. In the past, these were cable distribution companies, video stores, movie theaters, and newsstands. Today, news delivery is modular. It's distributed through a range of platforms, most of which are owned by a handful of US-based technology companies. News media rely on terrestrial and submarine fiber cables to enable hyperlinking, but also co-production and audience reach. They need content delivery networks like Akamai to stream content. They rely on cloud services like the ones provided by Microsoft and Amazon Web Services to store and manage data. They rely on web architecture like the ones provided by Google for website functionality. And news media have also relied for quite some time on social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube and TikTok to reach and engage their users, and also to generate advertising revenue. More and more, news media also grow increasingly dependent on the AI services provided by Microsoft, Alphabet, and Amazon for research and production, analytics, and also personalization of content. So, many of the key players here, they operate across sectors. Now this creates potential vulnerabilities along the value chain of news production and distribution, raising questions as to the resilience of the overall technological infrastructure for news globally. These resilience issues emerge because these technologies, and these are technologies that work really well, by the way, they're concentrating in power, and they're also concentrating geographically. So we are quickly approaching the point where it becomes impossible to operate sustainably without these services. So this leads to issues of dependency and potential capture, posing questions about the resilience of the information ecology overall. So how does this infrastructure create vulnerabilities for editorial media's ability to operate sustainably? How do we secure free editorial media in the future? So we will delve into these issues in this session. We will start by hearing two keynotes, followed by a panel discussion. So our first keynote is by Chris Despain. Chris is a corporate lawyer who for 16 years was the CEO of the manager of the Australian Internet Country Code, where he started the Australian IGF. He was a director of ICANN, so Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, for 9 years. And he was a member of the United Nations Secretary General's Internet Governance Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group for 6 years. And he continues to be heavily involved in ICANN and all areas of Internet governance. So, Chris, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. This is a really weird setup. Hang on, that's it. Let's get rid of that. I can hear myself properly instead of cutting out. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for asking me to be here. I was in two minds about how to do this, and in the end I decided that the best thing for me to do was to sort of level set and save all of the sort of controversial stuff for the discussion, because I have no doubt there's going to be some of that. So let me start by asking you to imagine waking up tomorrow morning to find that your favourite news outlet, maybe an independent investigative site or a local newspaper, trying to expose corruption, has vanished. Not because it's run out of money, not because it's broken the law, but because the infrastructure that it depended on, servers, cloud storage, content delivery systems, etc., was quietly turned off by a private company acting in its own interests and with no oversight or transparency. That's the reality. That could happen today. So the question that I'm going to address now is, how does the concentrated ownership of the internet's infrastructure affect a free and resilient news media? And in an era where information is both our most valuable resource and our most contested battleground, understanding the invisible hands shaping our access to news is more crucial than ever. We tend to think of the internet as an abstract space, a borderless cloud, a place where information flows freely. But it's not some ethereal democratic realm floating above us. It's physical, centralized, and privately owned. At every layer, from the undersea cables that carry data, to the data centers that host it, to the platforms that distribute it, real companies control real assets, and with that comes enormous power. So I think we're all clear what we mean by internet infrastructure, and I'm going to talk mainly about, with reference mainly to undersea cables and CDNs, content delivery networks, but it applies to all the layers. And these layers aren't just technical scaffolding, they're points of control. And when ownership of the layers is concentrated in the hands of a few, then we can create choke points that can be used intentionally or not to silence journalism, suppress dissent, or manipulate public discourse. The concentration isn't just about market share, it's about infrastructural power, the ability to shape, restrict, or enable the flow of information at the most fundamental level. As platforms and infrastructure providers consolidate, they evolve from mere gatekeepers to architects of the entire media ecosystem. Their control extends from the creation of news through to its distribution, and to how and whether it reaches you at all. When a small number of CDN providers control the infrastructure that delivers most of the web content, they also effectively act as gatekeepers. If they choose, voluntarily or under government or corporate pressure, to restrict access to certain news sources, those outlets may become practically invisible or unreliable. And of course, undersea cables are the physical backbone to the global internet, and that includes news delivery. A lot of people who aren't involved in this area think that the undersea cables are all owned by governments, and indeed some of them are. But a lot of them are owned by a small number of corporations, and the number of governments that own them is also very small. Control of this part of the infrastructure enables you to prioritize or deprioritize certain data flows, so you can favor your own platforms, your own services, or your own partners. Creates potential choke points where governments or companies can interfere with the transmission of independent journalism, and that's especially true in the case of crises or conflicts, not that we have any of those around at the moment. It can enable censorship by infrastructure, denial of access, and bandwidth throttling. Speaking of censorship, we traditionally worry about government censorship, but corporate censorship can be just as impactful and is often far more opaque. CDNs can remove or block content they consider controversial, false, or harmful. And whilst this may align with societal goals, it can also be abused to suppress legitimate investigation or whistleblowers. Infrastructure owners have, at times, been pressured by governments or acted on their own to block content or services. Examples include financial intermediaries cutting off funding to news organisations, app stores removing controversial apps, or network providers shutting down entire countries' access to the internet during political crisis. That's the imagine you woke up in the morning and you couldn't access the news channel. There are surveillance and privacy risks as well. Companies that own cables may monitor or be forced to share data with governments. It undermines the confidentiality of journalists, whistleblowers and sources. Surveillance at the infrastructure level, not just the software level, is far harder to detect or to resist. CDNs often handle DNS queries, TLS handshakes, and metadata about who accesses which news content. And concentrated ownership allows the aggregation of highly sensitive consumption data, which could be abused. The concentration can also put economic pressure on independent media. Tech giants who own cables also dominate social media distribution, search engines, cloud hostings, advertising markets. You'll notice I haven't named any of them. That's because I suspect we all know who they are. This vertical integration can financially squeeze independent media, who become dependent on a few platforms for both content distribution and monetization. Infrastructure control gives big companies even more leverage over the digital news economy. And there's, of course, the risk of geopolitical weaponization. Countries that dominate cable ownership, currently the US and China, can pressure or disrupt global information flows. In authoritarian regimes, state-owned or state-influenced companies can influence how news circulates internationally. And for smaller countries, the lack of ownership or control creates a dependency which reduces sovereignty over the information access. History shows that concentrated ownership, whether in traditional media or in digital infrastructure, poses serious risks to media pluralism and independence. When a few entities control the spaces and relationships on which media organizations depend, they can shape public discourse, not just by what they amplify, but by what they suppress. There's economic leverage too. News organizations, especially the smaller ones and local outlets, are dependent on the infrastructure owners for access, distribution, and revenue. This dependency can erode their editorial independence and long-term sustainability. And there's homogenization. Consolidation often leads to less original, more homogenized content, with a decline in local reporting and diversity of voices, even if overall content quality doesn't always suffer. I live in a small village in Norfolk in the UK, and it's reached the point now where the only way that I can really find out about what's going on in the local area is in the individual parish magazines that still get printed and delivered through the front door, because the local news is over. It doesn't really exist anymore. There are local papers, but all they have become is the delivery of advertising. The concentration introduces vulnerabilities that threaten the resilience of both the internet and the news media. Again, a small number of companies control critical infrastructure, so outages or targeted disruptions can have outsized effects. Look at the recent blackout in Portugal and Spain. If that doesn't highlight the importance of diverse providers and the reliance on a few actors making the system brittle, then nothing does. Witness the beautiful and glorious United Kingdom's privatised water system, where individual water authorities have a monopoly over delivery of water in various parts of the country, and nearly all of whom are polluting our rivers and waterways so that they can pay more money to their shareholders. Infrastructure owners can also become instruments of the state or corporate power, and wielding their control to advance political or economic interests, sometimes at the expense of press freedom and public interest. And when ownership is concentrated, failure of one operator or geopolitical tension, the thing I mentioned we didn't have very much of at the moment, can lead to severe disruptions. It's important to remember that news organizations often depend on real-time global access to sources, feeds, witnesses, and correspondence. And concentration makes the system itself more vulnerable to things like cable cuts, political sanctions or regulatory capture, and corporate decisions driven by profit, not by public interest. The consequences for democracy could be profound. As ownership concentrates, local and regional news media struggles. Their dependence on infrastructure and platforms controlled by distant actors undermines their ability to serve their communities and hold local power to account. It used to be possible. You may not be able to hold national power to account until there's an election, but you used to be able to hold local power to account simply because you had all the news and information and you could turn up at your council offices and shout at them a lot. Homogenised content and diminished local reporting weakens the public's ability to scrutinise those in power, leading to less informed citizens and diminished political participation. And of course, there are threats to pluralism. With fewer independent actors, the diversity of perspective shrinks. Minority voices are marginalised. Marginalised communities are marginalised and risk being excluded from conversation. So the challenges require a multi-pronged approach, of course, and I've no doubt we're going to talk about that some when we get to the panel. It may be that the traditional tools for limiting media concentration are not appropriate or don't work anymore. They've certainly broken down in the mainstream media. The rules used to be you couldn't own a newspaper and a television channel. Not anymore. Policy should encourage a diverse ecosystem of infrastructure providers and media organisations. Policy is important. How you set it is obviously also important, but that's another conversation. And infrastructure owners need to be held to high standards of transparency regarding their control over data flows and so on. And we should be investing in alternative infrastructure. Community-owned networks, independent hosting, and decentralised platforms are all within our own control if we choose to take that control. It's a fundamental challenge to the freedom, diversity and resilience of our news media. And if it's left unchecked, it risks entrenching new forms of gatekeeping, undermining local journalism and narrowing the spectrum of voices that sustain our democracy. But that said, it was ever thus. It might sound as if I'm suggesting we're headed towards the end of a diverse media or the death of local news or a single point of control of our news. And I don't believe that we are. Press barons have forever tried to manipulate what we read. If you look at the relatively recent fight between Prince Harry and Rupert Murdoch's news media, and his case for which he sued them, he won front page news in lots of newspapers, but bizarrely in the Murdoch press, a small article on the bottom of page 8. But the point is that the Murdoch press didn't have the power, despite the fact that it owns an awful lot of the media, to suppress the story. There are more opportunities today also for citizen journalists than there have ever been, and I think we're taking advantage of them. Part of the challenge, of course, is it's not always journalism. Sometimes it's just rhetoric. But above all else, we should never underestimate the resilience of us humans and our desire to be heard. I started out by asking you to imagine your favourite news network had vanished. Well, that's not something some people need to imagine. It has happened in several countries over the last 10 to 15 years, where the government has attempted to switch off the population's access to news. And what happens when that happens? Our own resilience kicks in. In one particular case, by folks heading up to their attics and dusting off their old modems and connecting to the world of news with 2 rubber caps and a soundscape of squeaks and buzzes over the good old-fashioned telephone. Even so, the choices we make today about the digital arteries of our society will shape the future of news, for expression and democratic participation for generations to come. It's our collective responsibility, policymakers, industry leaders, journalists and citizens alike, to ensure that the infrastructure of the internet serves the public good and not just private power. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that. Our next keynote speaker is Anya Schifrin. Anya is the director of the Technology, Media and Communications program at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. She has a PhD from the University of Navarra on the topic of online disinformation, and she has published extensively on journalism and sustainability, capture, and policies to support journalism globally. Anya is also a former journalist. She's been covering both Asia and Europe as a reporter for many years. So, Anya, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you all for inviting me, and Haley for organizing this. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. And I'm going to time myself because I have 15 minutes, but if I have to skip, I'm happy to send my talk to you later. It's really great to see old friends here like Pamela and Guy and Rasmus, and make some new friends too. And thank you to UNESCO for all the support over the years. I'm going to be depressing. I'm from Columbia University and I'm an American, so I'm extremely worried right now. We're in a terrifying moment, one in which it feels like everything we've worked to build over decades is being dismantled. Not for any good reason, not because thoughtful people who shared the values of an educated or equal society built on truth and science and scientific inquiry decided it was time to carefully consider how to make the world more fair, more just, provide services more efficiently. I'm referring to Doge, of course. No, everything we've worked for and believe in is being torn apart by autocrats because they can do it. They came to power because they had support from oligarchs and corporations with money enough to influence political processes. They had the support of frustrated voters who were variously angry about income inequality, wokeism, and migration. And in the US, as well as in other countries, these new leaders use every method they have to grab and hold power, define courts and institutions, civil service, and civil society. So now we're here trying to figure out what to do next. As usual, the media is on the front lines. Journalists believe that they're the guardians of truth and their work holds power to account. They work in local communities covering local news, institutions, and politicians. And they work across borders exposing massive global problems. They provide new information to change hearts and minds and be acted on by responsible governments that want to act. Quality information is even more important now in an age of AI slop, where the information ecosystem is awash in misleading images and strange blah words that sound like they mean something but don't. Public discourse has been totally debased in the US. Our leaders lie without compunction. They seem to lie on every topic, whether migration or vaccines or climate. They attack and they defame their opponents. They did what they did in the McCarthy era when they attacked the Voice of America and librarians burned and pulped books in the US overseas. What comes after this attack on science and academia? Confusion. Nathan Heller's New Yorker piece last November summed up the U.S. today. It's no longer the micro-targeted online disinformation that's the problem, but the general miasma of confusion. As he said, it's about seeding the ambience of information, throwing facts and fake facts alike into an environment of low attention. Worse is the terrifying public violence, the assassination in Minnesota, the people bringing their cars to protest to either crash into protesters or threaten them, not once, but repeatedly. It's all reminding me of the French sociologist Gabriel Tardet, who I teach in my class at Columbia. He talks about life before the public. Without the public, what did we have in the Middle Ages? Fairs, pilgrimages, tumultuous multitudes dominated by bias or belligerent emotions, angers, or panic. Sounds like today. I won't go into all the details that we all know so well about what happened to quality news media, the collapse of the business models, IP and content stolen by social media, changes in audience consumption patterns, loss of advertising revenue, capture by the state, the spread of news deserts. Rasmus will talk to you about trust, I'm sure, COVID-19 hitting advertising. Quality information is a public good, as my husband's been saying for decades, and few want to pay the full costs of production and dissemination. And that's true, of course, of art, culture, health, and many other essentials. But there's a cost to not producing public goods, and we are paying that price now. So here we are in 2025. Trump and Musk decided to cut funding for journalism around the world. Voice of America, startups in Africa, exile media from Russia and Ukraine, the intermediary organizations. It's a bloodbath ripping through the ecosystem. Some, such as Gina Neff and Taylor Owen, are saying that we need to have new regulatory frameworks. As the previous speaker pointed out, much of what we've done may not be enforceable in the future. Others, like Reddy and Glacier, have said we have to prepare for systems collapse. And they lay out in a recent paper, I think it was in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, different options for funders, whether it's protecting communities, blocking the worst parts, or being creative and willing to transform and fundamentally reimagine the sectors supported by foundations and under attack. Since we're talking today about platform dependency and the material conditions for a free and resilient news media, I want to talk about where I think those discussions are going and what I'm hearing around the world. I first want to acknowledge that there has been a tremendous amount of creative thinking already. I strongly agree with the view that journalists didn't innovate, that they spent too much time blaming the platforms. I think that journalists and donors have spent decades promoting engagement with audiences, supporting local news, trying to communicate and build trust with communities. They've innovated in endless ways, trying the subscription model, community building models, trying to earn income to replace what was lost to the tech advertising monopoly. Governments in many countries, including Norway, have done a huge amount to support public interest news. So I don't think this is a moment when we all need to sit around and criticize ourselves. I think we've done enough of that. The time is action. There's been also, let me point out, tremendous engagement with the platforms. Attempts have been made to create voluntary codes of conduct, require data transparency, work together to develop new forms of technology and income stream. And it was only when those attempts were not sufficient that government stepped in and tried to help publishers. The good news is we have the tools. Governments tried first with voluntary measures, but they know how to do tax policy and they know how to regulate monopolies. Many, especially in this part of the world, have done a terrific job supporting public broadcasting and journalism. But when government has tried to use their powers to tax and legislate, they were met with platform resistance. The platforms have shown themselves to be bad actors in many cases. I have a little list. They have polluted the information ecosystem by making money from spreading mis- and disinformation and hate speech. They steal intellectual property, and by stealing it, they weaken the ability of those who want to provide good information to be able to do it. They've become monopoly capitalists, and they have stifled innovation. They've engaged in tax avoidance despite reaping enormous profits from their monopoly power. The oligarchs heading these firms have used their wealth to interfere with the political process and written the rules in the U.S. to benefit themselves, their monopolies, and they've done the same things in countries around the world. They have not respected attempts to get them to pay for IP copyright. Their playbook was and is the U.S. classic corporate playbook for lobbying, PR efforts, spreading misinformation about laws, commissioning research, and threatening exit. And I have a book chapter that I wrote with Felipe Lauritsen coming out next year that looks at South Africa and Brazil as case studies for this classic American corporate playbook in tech. So some regulators, I'm thinking here of Rod Sims and the Australian Competition Commission, came to realize that the heart of the problem is platform dominance and power asymmetries between platforms and publishers. This is why in Australia it was the competition authorities rather than the Copyright Office that tried to get platform remuneration for publishers. The Australian case is significant because it led to payments by Google and Meta, along with a raft of measures enacted by government which helped shore up declining local news. But we saw what happened in Canada when they adopted a similar law. Meta responded by dropping news, which caused a collapse in website traffic. We saw in Brazil how Google lobbied against similar laws, South Africa, and in California and all over Europe, dropping news as a test. And now we have yesterday's announcement from Google that they're also going to pull out of many of the Australian laws. And as always, they blame the victim. Oh, it's the Labour Party's fault for not, being clear. Anyway, my point is that the platform intransigence has led regulators to consider a host of new measures. Late 2024, Australia announced that platforms that didn't want to negotiate with publishers could pay a digital levy, which would be more expensive than what bargaining code payments would be. South Africa is also looking at digital levies, and many countries are considering things like digital services taxes with funding earmarked for journalism. I don't want to go over time, but I'll just say a few things. So in the OSCE, we have this report coming out on platform dependencies and publishers, which we're presenting in September and October. And we talk about must-carry and visibility policies. This, I think, is a very dramatic shift. And I'm not sure that much of it would actually even be implementable in the US because of First Amendment considerations, which preclude compelled speech. But I think there's two things to remember. One is, had the platforms agreed to previous laws and attempts, we would not be in this position where we're now looking at really what I consider fourth best measures. And the only way to get concessions is to proceed from platforms is to proceed with legislative proposals. Otherwise, they do not act. I think that the next frontier is going to have to be some sort of AI tax, possibly with funding given to support journalism. And I see four policy options. Free for all, where the LLM AI companies can scrape whatever they want online, and creators and publishers have no protection. This is what we saw during the training period. The second path would be one in which there is a strict policy of no use of intellectual property. This is clearly unrealistic. So now we have two options which involve paying for the use of IP. One would be a fixed scale of fees that are predetermined. Payments to pharma companies during periods of compulsory licensing of medications are one example. I know the South Africans in the room are very familiar, and India as well, with compulsory licensing regimes. I think, frankly, I'm working on a paper now with a team of economists, and that is what we're going to be proposing. And then the other point, of course, is more what Australia did, which is you lay out a negotiations framework. And this has to be done because the competitive environment has a direct bearing on negotiations. This was the whole entire point that Australia understood. You don't have fair negotiations when it's a couple of monopolies that are doing at the table. So I want to be really clear. I've got 5 more minutes. I'll give back a couple of dates. I want to be clear about what we're up against. The U.S. government has made it clear that it opposes both tech regulation and taxation all over the world. There's a proposal in Trump's current budget to preempt state regulation on AI for 10 years. This is really important because in the U.S. we have federal systems, so states do quite a lot. And if they're not able to regulate AI for 10 years, we have a huge problem on our hands. Another thing is, I don't know if you've heard about the revenge tax. This is a provision in the new budget which would punish companies in countries that try to enforce the OECD tax agreement on global minimum corporate taxes, which you may remember was settled at 15%, which is pretty low, or impose digital services taxes. So this is the U.S. saying, we're taxing you back if you do either of these things. Now, the funny thing about this, the revenge tax is such a bad idea that the U.S. business community has hired lobbyists to try to kill it. That's amazing if U.S. business doesn't even want a law that's supposed to protect them. And the New York Times had a great article about this last week. So let's make no mistake about what's happening in the U.S. Trump and his friends oppose mis- and disinformation research and legislation because they like to lie online. Trump and Vance and their Silicon Valley allies oppose paying for IP because that would eat into their profit. That's what's happening here. Let's not muddy the waters with talking about First Amendment or anything else. So here's the question. Can Europe stick together? In the US, those of us who care about this stuff want to know whether the EU and the rest of the world will cave, capitulate, or whether it will stick with its plans to tax and regulate big tech. India has apparently agreed to roll back its 6% tax on digital advertising. There's also discussion, including the head of financing for development meeting in Seville next week, where I'll be going, about whether having the U.S. out of global discussions is better because it means the rest of the world can go on with making their own plans. Normally what the U.S. does is negotiators demand concessions to international frameworks, they drag out the discussions, and then in the end, after dragging out, wasting everyone's time, watering down, they just refuse to sign because Congress won't pass it anyway. So I don't think the EU and the rest of the world and the international community has any choice. Either the U.S. is isolationist and out of the picture for the long term, in which case the rest of the world has to move ahead in all sorts of areas without us, or the U.S. returns to sanity, in which case it's good to have spent a few years developing smart policies and the U.S. can catch up later. Thank you for including me, and I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you for that, Anya. I'm going to introduce the panel now. Our panel today consists of 5 distinguished actors working in the areas of policy, industry, and academia. First, we have Pamela Sitoni. She's a Kenyan journalist and author. She's a media and communications consultant and the public editor at Nation Media Group in Kenya. She's previously served as executive editor and managing editor of Daily Nation, the East African, and Standard newspapers in Kenya. She has also worked as a communication specialist for the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, in Kenya. Pamela? Stavrum is CEO of Tinius Trust, and she's the chair of the board of Schibsted Media. She has a background as a journalist and editor, and she served as the general secretary of the Norwegian Press Association and chair of the latest Norwegian Freedom of Expression Commission. We have Rasmus Claes Nielsen. He is a professor at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark and a senior research associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, where he also served as director of research for many years. He's published extensively on political communication, the business of news, platform dependency, and misinformation, and he is co-author of the annual Reuters Institute Digital News Report. Anine Kierulf is a Norwegian lawyer and associate professor of constitutional law at the University of Oslo. She's a special advisor to the Norwegian Human Rights Institution. Anine has served as legal advisor to the Council of Europe, and she served as chair of the Commission of Academic Freedom of Expression here in Norway. Taufik Jelassi is the Assistant Director General for Communications and Information at UNESCO. He has a PhD in Information Systems from New York University, and he served as Minister of Higher Education, Scientific Research, and Information and Communication Technologies in Tunisia. He's also Professor of Strategy and Technology Management at IMD Lausanne. And we also have on stage our 2 keynote speakers, Anja Schifrin and Chris Despain. And Taufik is joining us now. Okay. Welcome to the panel, everyone. We'll start with the section on reactions to our 2 keynote presentations, I think. I want to start maybe with you, Rasmus. Chris tells this story of concentration in the internet sector, and he draws this line back to the press barons, in a sense. Do you think it's a good parallel? Is it the same old story?
I mean, I think I'm reminded of the quote from the movie Casablanca, that he's like other men, only more so. I think it is the same old story, even only much more pronounced, in that the concentration of power we see today is increasingly transnational, even global, and that is more accentuated than the history that Chris rightly outlined. I also think it's important to keep in mind that in addition to the sort of corporate story of triumph and tragedy that we all know so well, the sort of the animal spirits of the market and they have been quite animalistic, that have been unleashed in these areas. There's also a political story that I think Chris gestured towards when you mentioned sort of privatization of water, for example, utilities, but also the watering down of cross-media ownership legislation. And I think if we want to understand where we are today, it's important to pay attention to the current inhabitant of the White House, but also the history of this. The moment we're in today, I think, has a political history that goes back at least to George W. Bush and the Barack Obama administration, to the Blair prime ministership and the David Cameron prime ministership, to Chancellor Schröder and to Chancellor Merkel, in terms of a long period in which corporate consolidation, liberalization, and opening up media markets have not only been accepted but endorsed and wholeheartedly pursued by establishment political parties of both the center left and the center right. So, for example, here is a quote. Our companies have created the internet, expanded it, perfected it in ways that other countries can't compete. And oftentimes what is portrayed as high-minded positions and issues sometimes is just designed to carve out some of their own commercial interests. This is not a quote from the current inhabitant of the White House. This is a quote from President Obama from 2015. Right, so there's a political story here of deliberate non-intervention and deregulation that is across the political spectrum and across the Atlantic. And in fact, if we are to believe what we read in the press today, the brief of the current European Commission is not to respond to the hopes of many people who attend events like this. It is allegedly deregulation, corporate consolidation, and apparently, if what we're told today by the Wall Street Journal about the possibility of pausing enforcement of the DSA for U.S. companies, it's to make geopolitical concessions in the interest of maintaining some sort of tie across the Atlantic. So I think there is a very important political story here if we want to understand who is responsible for where we are today, and I think that should probably inform as to what we hope from the same actors going forward.
Thank you. Anina, do you think we're too late in regulating this space? How would you describe the current challenges to the information ecology and human rights?
Yeah, I very much agree with Rasmus. We're certainly too late. But in some ways, I think law is always too late. We're sort of trailing the world. The world goes on, and we run after it and try and regulate it and mend all the things that don't work with regulations, and that's the way that law works generally, and it's been like that in the meeting of all new technologies and even like, I don't know, cars, everything. But the situation today is very different because the world is spinning a lot faster, so it's hard to trail. And the internet is fast, the technology companies are really fast, everything's going at a much higher pace and reaching out to a number of more people a lot faster than in any previous ways of technology, I think. And so law is trailing the world, but democracy is by its nature slow. And that's to try and get people involved and listen to what the constituents have to say about things. Obviously, we have to do that, but seeing a model for regulation that incorporates that slowness into the way the pace that the world is working with today, I think is very, very difficult. So the challenge is to free speech, obviously, but particularly perhaps freedom of information. I mean, the big internet revolution, obviously, it's all people get to speak freely about what they want, where they want, in some ways, at least on the mercy of big tech companies. But the big difference, I think, with internet and even before social media is the absolute overflow of unchecked information. So the model that we've sort of been relating to up until the internet came is one where some fact checkers, some quality checkers, some guardians have always sort of filtered the information that we get. And that's so very different today, and it's really hard to envision how to meet that, even with more training in digital literacy and critical thinking. It's very hard to keep up because we as human beings or netizens are also a lot slower than the machines are going right now.
Yeah, so regulation is usually reactionary, right? And politics is usually national, and these systems are global,
Yes.
in a sense. So Anja paints a kind of a bleak picture of where we are today. I want to ask you, Pamela, what do you think about Anja's warning that we shouldn't rely on the US to regulate this space? How is this dependency felt in the African context?
Thank you, and thank you, Anja, for that wonderful presentation. I couldn't agree with you more in terms of the rest of the world really looking at America's opposition to regulation, America's opposition to taxation of these media tech companies, and thinking about a solution that includes everybody else. I think for me, my question would be the how to go about it, because when you look at Africa's situation, for example, we find ourselves in a situation where we can't really have the bargaining power against these companies. We look at a company like Google or Meta, and if they pulled out of Africa, what difference would it make to their bottom line? Obviously none, but what impact would it have on the information flow in that part of the world? A great impact. So we find ourselves kind of in a catch-22 situation, and I think I would look at what Chris said about policies, and also about creating an ecosystem where these companies are actually made to play by a global playbook and not specific rules for specific countries. So what Google does in Australia, it should also be compelled to do the same in Africa. And also we have had situations where these companies are allowed to pick and choose. They pick and choose who to work with, which media house to work with, who to pay and how much to pay. So this call for accountability and transparency, I think, should be made to apply globally and not in specific regions only. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Kjersti, from a sort of an industry perspective, how real is this power really felt in the industry? What are the threats to freedom of information?
I think it was two great keynotes. I think what we see, in my opinion, is that social media or the platforms, they are amplifying the weaknesses of the society in where they operate. So when we see this polarization in the US, it was there already. Like in the Philippines, where Maria Ressa always have strong and clear messages from. The Philippines were never a good place before Facebook either. But I guess at least we in this room share this mission of trying to foster a well-informed and enlightened public debate. And depending on the problem, the answer is almost always trusted media, trusted edited media. And at this very moment, actually, VG, Norway's major private free media outlet, is celebrating its 80th anniversary. So the Prime Minister is there. I should have been there myself, but I'm here. Anyway, that makes it possible for me to tell you that VG has, in a population of 5 million people, daily 2 million visitors, and 1.5 million comes directly to VG. That is both extremely impressive. I think almost all media outlets in the world envy them those figures. Isn't that right, Rasmus? But it is a result of them. They were funded actually after the Second World War as a democracy project, and that project is still going on. They've had a very clear policy for what their role was in society, and they work on that role very proudly. And I think I agree with Anina also, because I agree to all. I guess that is how echo chamber develop. But I think the regulation has been too slow because we had the assumptions wrong. We assumed that the US was an ally for our liberal democracy, and now we know for sure that it's not. So of course, it was too late. We didn't treat the challenges seriously enough, but we are doing it now, I think. And And I think we more and more see parallel to what we saw in the 1990s when the climate policy also understood that the polluter had to pay. So we are sort of copying the polluter pays principle that was established back then. And I think that has, of course, both an economic aspect, but it's likewise important that it has a moral aspect of it. I think that's fair because we see that when not accountable platforms does not or are spreading pollution into our information climate, there are someone else that are left to clean up the mess, and very often that is the edited media. And I think that to make the polluter pay, I think we can enforce those that are edited and those that are responsible. And like, for instance, VG, they adhere to the Norwegian media responsibility law, and also is part of a very beautiful press ethical system that Norway has, and the Nordics share almost likewise. That I think is of great importance, but in the end we cannot sort of be lame duck facing those that are not playing by the rules that we others are. It's not more complicated than that.
Yeah, you're talking about some very clear institutional differences, I guess, between the two sectors. Tawfik, how is UNESCO working to ensure that we have a free information space in the context of the keynotes that we hear today?
Thank you, Helle. First of all, my thanks to both keynote speakers, because I think that they set the stage very carefully and thoroughly, and they were very eloquent in putting the arguments forward. I am tempted to add to the title. It's not only conditions for a free and resilient news media, but also for a trustworthy news media. To pick on the previous panelist who brought up the issue of trust. And the previous panelist also mentioned Maria Ressa, and her famous quote, she said, "Without facts, there is no truth. And without truth, there is no trust. And without trust, there is no shared reality upon which we can act." Today, we do have a new shared reality, and as it was mentioned before, it calls us to act. So what UNESCO has done 3 years ago, it has launched a major global initiative called For an Internet of Trust, which was an inclusive multi-stakeholder process involving not only the 194 member states of UNESCO, but also civil society organizations, tech companies, platform operators, academia, research, technical community, organizing 3 global open consultations, receiving 10,000 inputs from these stakeholders, inputs coming from over 134 countries. And what I have in my hand here is a booklet published about a year ago. It's called the UNESCO Guidelines for the Governance of Digital Platforms. And it calls, or it spells out, the conditions for a free, resilient, trustworthy media, clearly defining the responsibility in terms of transparency, accountability, user empowerment, independent regulators and oversight bodies. Why doing that? Because I don't think it's the why is clear and the what is clear, but the how today is the challenge, how to go about it. And we believe that regulation showed its limits. Self-regulation did not work, did not deliver. We need maybe a co-regulatory system which is truly multi-stakeholder, and that was our base. And to anchor the process in human rights standards, because it's also about individual dignity, it's about data privacy, it is about the user empowerment, as I said a minute ago. So the good news that we are now implementing these guidelines. We have pilot implementation underway. We set up a network of 80 regulators from all over the world. And we had last year the first UNESCO Global Conference for Regulatory Authorities. Why we need them? Because, of course, they can contextualize these guidelines, and they can, of course, take into account, and they have to, the specificities of regions and countries when implementing these set of principles. So this is an effort, but again, I stress the multi-stakeholder, the multilateral, the inclusive process, because what some of you mentioned is a problem for society at large, and there is no one single country or actor who can tackle this issue successfully. We need to join forces to achieve our goal.
Thank you. So, Anya, how you kind of outline where the US is now sort of isolationist. What's your hope or belief in these sort of global systems? Is it going to work if the US isn't able to or willing to collaborate, to pull out, as you say?
Well, I think it's, and I know we talked about this during the South African hearings, it's very normal for companies to threaten to exit. That is what they always do. And I understand, I've heard so many people in Africa say what Pamela's saying. In terms of economics, the exit threat really makes no sense because these companies make money off news and quality information. And even if they had to share some of the surplus, they would still be making plenty of profit, right? So makes no sense to exit. I think sort of three things. One is clearly, as Pamela pointed out, countries and publishers have to negotiate collectively. You know, the Danish examples is really important. So Kenya by itself might not feel like a good market, but all of Africa is a market. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, let's be realistic. If these companies exit, Chinese technology will take over. So TikTok or whoever will just take on this job. So there is actually an alternative, and those platforms know that. And then finally, eventually, other countries would develop their own technology. So, you know, Indonesian telecom, Brazil, South Africa, there would be more innovation later. And I'm not, as I mentioned before, you know, none of these options are great options, but that's where we're at.
Yeah. Chris, it seems like most of the panel agree with you in your... Are you disappointed?
You're assuming I agree with myself.
Care to disagree with yourself?
Well,
panel?
I do think that we need to be a little bit careful about what we say. I've heard most people talking about regulation. Mm-hmm. Different people hear different things when you say regulation. Is that better? Lovely. If the Chinese government hears regulation, it means something completely different to when Tavik was talking about regulation. With him, I agree, because he was talking about multi-stakeholder regulation, or what I would call policy, global policy that can be implemented around the world. And I think there's quite a danger in talking about regulation because it feeds into the narrative of some of the more authoritarian governments around the world. What we need is global policy. And what we need is the good guys, and I'm not going to say who I think the good guys are, but the good guys need to actually buy into the global multi-stakeholder way of making policy. And what that means is that you have to take the good with the bad. It means that you're not going to win every argument, and what you can't do if you're a government is, if you don't win something, pick up your bucket and spade and go home and create your own laws to make it happen. And there is a tendency for that to be happening right now in certain places around the world, not a million miles from where we are today. So all I would say is, yes, I do agree that we need to figure out ways of making sure that we maintain the diversity, we maintain an open and free, resilient media. But just by saying we probably need to regulate isn't going to cut it. I just want to say one other thing, which is that we do have open, resilient media. It does exist around the world. It's not everywhere, but it does exist. It exists in the Australian Broadcasting Corporation in Australia. It exists in the jolly old BBC. It's been with me all my life and wins as independent because everyone hates it. And that's a key point. If everyone is equally unhappy, if when the left is in government, they think the BBC is right-wing, when the right is in government, they think the BBC is left-wing. That's how you do it. And it does work. But of course, they're under threat too, because of the funding model. Not because Google owns an undersea platform, but because of the funding model. And how's that going to work? So this is a much bigger problem, I think, than just those, ownership of stuff. And as Anya said, if Google or Microsoft or that lot can't own undersea cables, then the Chinese will come and put them in and so on and so forth. And then there's even more of a challenge. One final thing, which is we get an awful lot of stuff for free. Except it isn't, of course, free. And I'm reminded of a conversation with Tim Berners-Lee, sorry to name drop, when was the agreement that we would get free access to everything that's on the internet and a free email account that we can use completely freely, and we wouldn't have to pay anything for that at all? When did that happen? It never did. There was always a price. Thanks.
Can we get back to just the issue of trust a little bit? Because Kjersti, you talked a little bit about this and about resilience and the power of these companies and the discrepancies between the institutional ethics of journalism and technology companies on the other side. What do you think the media can do to counter these dependencies? Or is there any way to work together in a very competitive space? What's the future here?
Well, maybe my answer can start by addressing Chris' sort of warning against regulation or thinking of and using the word regulation, because everything that we're discussing has these dilemmas, and what seems bright from a democracy perspective is black when you when you go to Turkey, and then it is the opposite. If you are Erdogan and hear the lovely word of anti-terror law, then he will just run out and find another journalist that maybe has assaulted him. So that is the dilemma. But I at this time, I still think that we need to take care of our own geographies, so that not more and more are sort of sliding into a situation which is not bearable and very difficult to handle. That was the start, but I do think that we should talk about ethics, because ethics is of such an extreme importance, and I think it's interesting, for instance, since we're sitting here in Oslo, to see what the Nordics has in common. All the Finland, Sweden, Norway, and to some extent Denmark has this brilliant press ethical system. I think the Danish is a little bit different, because it's the Ministry of Justice that appoints the press council, but in the other countries it's independent. And if I have one dream, it would be that the medias in all the geographies that are natural to divide, for instance, Europe into, come together and establish a free, fair, and fast press ethical system. Because that makes everything so much easier, and it's a fast lane towards trust, I think, because then you can complain. Over years you will see that media that adhere to a press ethical system, they comply, and they feel part of holding up the standards. Like take a very, very easy example is that how often do you think that the Norwegian media has published a story that have been criticized in the press council for revealing people's privacy or private life? It hardly never happens.
Anine, you have a comment to that?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add on to what Kjersti said and what Chris says here too, because keeping that local perspective, even while looking at the world, going backwards, I think is very important, and also both to sort of be examples for other regions, obviously, but also to sort of remind ourselves what is really at stake here, and how far we can really get with regulations, no matter what kinds of regulations we're talking about. Because if you see like some of the backsliding in the US now, is really following the books of the law, digging up like really old statutes from the 1700s and so forth. But you're using laws as a pretext for doing what is absolutely contrary to both the rule of law and to democracy. So it takes really sort of good faith constitutionalism for that to work. And I think the same applies in this sector. You would have to have sort of a good faith approach to all of this stuff. And in that respect, I think the ethic dimension comes in to be really important.
Yeah, and you're thinking both at the sort of local, national, and global level. So, because Pamela was talking about issues of accountability and transparency, how do you think we achieve that at these different levels? Is it a global question, or can we work nationally, locally for that? Yes, Pamela, please.
I think it has to be both. So at the local level, as the panelist who spoke before me has mentioned, it's important that we have regulations or ethical guidelines that guide us. And I think this is really, for what we call legacy media, it's a no-brainer. We all operate within the tenets of good journalism. The issue really is that the platforms are open for anybody and everybody, and there's disinformation and misinformation. And in fact, I always look at this as the flip side to that is that then the credible media have a chance to forge more trust with their audiences, because they are the to-go-to platforms, and people will go there for what they believe to be factual, and so therefore they have to operate within the rules. But when I was talking about accountability and transparency for the big platforms, I mean, we're just looking at issues of even how they work out the algorithms, which they do not disclose. They decide, as Chris said, they can decide what information to put out there and what to censor based on their relationships with government. They can endanger lives. I think the most current story from Kenya, where I come from right now, is about a young man who put out something on X, and it displeased a high-ranking police official. And because of that, he was arrested and he was murdered in the police cells because this information was made available, was revealed by the platform, and they were able to track him down and actually arrest him, and then he was murdered in the police cells. So when you're talking about these issues, it's life-threatening. It threatens the rights of the people to expression, the freedom of expression, even to freedom to just be alive. So these are serious issues, and it's important that we look at the best way to have that accountability and to hold platforms accountable for what they do. And then the other issue is the whole issue of media sustainability. I'm happy to see that in Europe, most countries actually, the media is funded by states, but in places like Africa, where independent media used to rely on a business model that has now collapsed, transition to digital media has become very slow and painful, and it affects the quality of the journalism. It affects how much information, how they can do their stories, how they cannot do, for example, deep investigative stories for lack of funding. And it's all because of how the whole ecosystem is owned by somebody who can decide how much money they can pay you for your content. They can take your IP for no pay, and you literally have nowhere to go. We have a case right now where Meta is arguing on whether it should be sued in Kenya or not, and because they don't have physical offices in Kenya, and yet they continue to violate the IP of Kenyans or Kenyan organizations. So I think the whole governance in that space is very important.
Can I come in, Haley, with a add-on?
Sure.
You know what my husband is now saying is that the platforms need to post $1 billion bond before they start operations in countries like Kenya or Brazil, so that when there's a fine, they have to pay it. Because in too many places, they're going around saying we don't have staff. So let them put down a bond or a deposit, and then they can be fined.
Yeah, like a rainy day fund. Anina, is sovereignty a word we can use here? And is data sovereignty, digital sovereignty? What is is there a path?
Well, we wish, I suppose.
Yeah.
It would be nice if we had our own ecosystems and our own infrastructure for taking care of our own data and our own information. But it seems that's a little way ahead. I think it would be very important to think like that. And we're obviously totally lagging behind. I think it was Timothy Garton Ash in his 10 Principles of Free Speech. He's talking about the dogs and the cats and the mice. So the dogs are the states and the mice are us. And the cats are the big tech companies in between, who obviously don't obey by any rules and do whatever they like. And so that's kind of the situation where we're in, only that some of the big dogs are teaming up with some of the big cats. And that leaves us a lot more vulnerable than we've been up to now. So I think there's no way outside of thinking sovereignty. I'm not a technologist, so I have no idea how that would actually be able to work out in practice. And I sometimes miss in conversations like this, not like this one, but conversations on this topic, is that people who are interested in freedom and journalism and democracy and human rights are not always talking so much to the technologists, and vice versa, so that if we could team up in a way that informed us both better, maybe that could be at least one step ahead in that direction.
Well, we're here at IGF, so maybe. I want to ask Rasmus about alternatives in a minute, but Chris and Shasti have asked for a comment. So, Chris?
Just a couple of things I wanted to say. Just on the digital sovereignty thing. The challenge with that is, does it work unless you try and go extraterritorially? And that's a really difficult thing. The European Commission continues to attempt to regulate various parts of the domain name system extraterritorially, and it's a real challenge because it simply, well, basically doesn't work. But the thing I wanted to pick up on was what Pamela was talking about, because she gave a really good example about the ethics of revealing someone's name, and that therein lies the real challenge, because there are the ethical judgment in some cases, the good ethical judgment in some cases would be you should reveal, and the bad ethical judgment in some cases would be you should reveal. So it's really, really hard to figure out a way through that, because at the end of the day, it's not you should reveal or you shouldn't. It's what are the circumstances, and that by definition depends on your definition of who the good guys are and who the bad guys are.
Yeah, Shasti?
Oh, I just wanted to start with me. I have that cat at home, and it's absolutely ignorant to all rules. And I think that's very good.
You see, you have a big tech company working
I definitely have. It's a cat.
Right.
But let's build on that one, because I think we have no choice. We need to develop national digital infrastructure. What we see around us leaves us no other choice. And I think we have in Norway, for instance, Telenor working on cloud storage, extremely important. We have some huge media companies like Schibsted, where I'm board head, and I think the policymakers need to find out how does this 2025 going onward media policy look like. It should facilitate tech development. It should make it. It should be as broad as possible, so that it sort of communicates with the framework of the free press in the world we live today. That will leave the media free and not so vulnerable to changes in the policy making. But sort of leveling the playing field with these big ignorant cats.
Yeah, Rasmus, do you think that's an option to build public alternatives?
Of course it is. I mean, there are plenty of options, but I think the real question is we need to hold people in positions of power, including public and political power, to account in terms of how they understand the system and whether they act accordingly. And I think the question here is, when looking at dependence on U.S. American big commercial platform companies, is which part of that phrase you stress, right? So if you think the problem is that they're U.S. American, then the path you pursue is obvious. It is that you try to create national, or in the case of Europe, regional champions. And then when they have the right passport and you are reliant on grande technologie rather than big tech, things are fine, right? Because then those companies are beholden to a different set of politicians, and then let's just hope that whoever is the next inhabitant of the Élysée is not going to abuse that power the way that we see in some other cases. And then the question is whether we as the mice can expect very different behavior from large corporations who hold different passports. And I think that all of those of you who have been at the receiving end of European capitalism around the world, I think you will ask yourself whether you really think it's fundamentally different from US American capitalism. Then the second way to think about the problem is that they are big. Now, then the alternatives are also, I think, quite clear. You're thinking about decentralized, federated, open source solutions. Now, I think it needs to be very clear that very few people in positions of power seem to think this is the problem, because if they did, they would pursue those alternatives already, because they exist, like the Fediverse, right, with Mastodon, or LibreOffice. There are options in this space, and we have now 25 years of revealed preference from people in positions of power. This is not what they want. So those alternatives exist, but they are not being pursued. And finally, of course, your analysis might be that the problem is that they are commercial. And that's where we can turn to the possibility of public service alternatives. And I think it's possible to do this. It's not easy. We need to decide what are they going to do. You know, there are many layers of the stack one could look at. How are they going to be funded? This is not going to be cheap. Who's going to make the rules and who's going to enforce them? Like all the controversies we see around content moderation decisions, imagine those only with the politicians in your country of origin making the decisions rather than Mark Zuckerberg and his oversight board. So it's not easy, but it can certainly be done. The question then is a question of priorities, right? In Europe alone, we spend an estimated 40 billion euros a year on public service media. That has been stagnant, in some cases declining in recent years, but we could make investments of a similar size. Europe is a $20 trillion GDP region. Public spending in Europe alone is 10 trillion euros a year. It's a question of priorities. And that's why I think we really need to be clear about, if we are to pursue the route that Kirsty endorsed, we have the means. It's a question of choices.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Taufik, did you have a comment?
Yes, the issue of ethics was brought up a couple of panelists earlier. And the question was, the statement was that the media needs to adhere to ethical standards and norms. But the question is, are these local, national ethics standards, or are these global? I would say, I think it's both, because technology and the platforms are global by nature, are borderless. Therefore, you cannot only apply national policy or approach to it. And here I wanted to flag out a piece of work that UNESCO has done, which is the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which was approved by all 193 member states back in 2021. And the set of principles, including on the media, including on freedom of expression, including on access to information, within this ethics of AI recommendation, are currently being implemented in over 70 countries, 70 countries worldwide. So again, we have a base. I'm not saying that's the answer to all issues, but there is a base. And this is part of the UNESCO work, which is a standard setting, normative instruments in a consensus, multi-stakeholder way. So of course we are not, because some of you mentioned the European Commission and the DSA, etc. UNESCO does not have that executive power, cannot find the bad guys, the bad players. All what it can do is advocacy, norm setting, and trying to help move the needle.
Well, you brought up artificial intelligence, and I also have that on my notes. How does that development sort of increase or challenge these dependencies. These are many of the same companies involved in the material internet and also in the AI race. What should we really be prepared for here in terms of how market power develops and ethics and regulation and also for independent journalism in general? Maybe I can start with you, Pamela.
Thanks. I think, first of all, I strongly believe that any technological advancement, including AI, is good, and it is not mutually exclusive to good journalism. And the core of journalism will always remain, which is to tell stories. AI will not replace journalism. It is not going to replace the way we tell. It might replace how we tell some of our stories, but it will not create stories for us if it's used responsibly as a tool. And we've seen already a lot of media houses are applying AI. But I think for me, it just goes back to that whole control and ownership conversation about the platforms, where you have now you have the tech companies, they own the platforms, they own the distribution network, but they also want to own that content. And I'll just give the example of the Google AI overview and what it's doing for media houses already right now. Just by gleaning all information about topics and putting it out there for the audience, media houses have done research and they've seen that because of that, the traffic to their own websites reduces significantly. And what that means is therefore that they cannot monetize their own content, they cannot monetize it for advertising either. And eventually I see a vicious cycle of just doom for both the media houses and even the internet ecosystem, because the more you starve the media houses of revenue and ability to generate independent, verified information, the more you starve the whole ecosystem of this information. So for me, I think the world should be very worried about what these companies are doing with AI, and also force them to be ethical or force them to pay for that content. If they are gleaning content from the credible sites, then they need to pay those sites for what they're generating out of it.
Yeah, these are also large global structures that we're talking about here. And I want to sort of end the panel or come to a discussion about what we can do as maybe small states or the role of small states in this context. And maybe start with Rasmus and also ask you, Anja, after that, what is advice you could give to small states in this context? Rasmus?
I mean, I speak as a sort of an academic who come from a small state, so I think I'll wear sort of both hats. And I think as an academic, my finest obligation is to call it as I see it, also when it's inconvenient or unpopular. And when we think about this from the point of view of small states, perhaps I'm reminded of the quote from Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars, that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, which we should, of course, remember he didn't write because he was sort of an inspiring manosphere, would-be influencer. He didn't write this to endorse this. He wrote this as a description of what he saw as the reality of power politics. And I think that is useful to keep in mind if you come from a small country. And as an academic, I would just say I think we need an honest debate, public debate, with politicians taking responsibility for the choices that they're making. I don't think my personal views on how elected officials balance between the urgency of climate change, of national security, of shoring up welfare systems with aging populations, of ensuring a productive economy while also ensuring sustainability, vis-a-vis issues of digital sovereignty and technological autonomy. I don't think my personal views on how they balance those are particularly interesting. What I will say is I think it's very important to be clear that even small states, as long as they're not desperately poor, have power and can make different choices, and those choices matter greatly in terms of the outcomes. I don't think we should accept the sort of pretend helplessness of powerful politicians who, by that way, escape scrutiny and responsibility for the actions that they take. And I don't think that's any different from their choices about where they buy their military hardware, how they deal with climate change, how they deal with changes to the welfare system, migration, or anything else. So I think there are choices also for small states, at least if they're not desperately poor and marginalized, which of course some are. And I think we're seeing some countries exercise those choices. And then, we can hope that they'll be informed by all the wonderful sentiments that have been expressed at a sort of aspirational panel like this.
Yeah, so accountability also towards the political system. Yeah. Anja, did you have a comment?
Sure. I'm not obviously from a small state, unless we count New York. But I think I would absolutely agree with Rasmus. And clearly, I'm thinking about when all the island nations got together because of climate change, because they knew they were going to get affected first. I think that there are regional leaders. So I think, South Africa and in Nigeria, I think Brazil, I think there's Indonesia, I think there's lots of countries out there that can play a role. On taxes, I think it's been really interesting, the push towards having the UN instead of the OECD. So I think it's going to have to be collective efforts to tackle a lot of this.
I mean, is there a balance here between states' responsibilities and, people? What can we do?
The mice.
Yeah, the mice.
Well, if you can't sort of fix the things that threatens you, maybe you can fix how you're being threatened. So some practice in digital literacy, obviously. And being a teacher myself, but at the university level, I seem to see a shift in students in that their critical thinking is a lot better, which is good because that's been sort of a priority, I suppose, but that their knowledge is a lot less. So I think it was Tawfiq quoting Maria Ressa saying that without facts, there's no truth. So just to stick to that part of the quote, I think that's very important that we our focus on critical thinking is not is not sort of going on the cost of thinking about truth and knowledge too, because we need to have some basis for that critical thinking, and I believe that's really important now. Not just that we learn how these systems and these algorithms are working and how these black boxes are affecting us, but also that we learn more about ourselves and why we're so vulnerable to this way of manipulation that we're being subject to right now.
I think that's a great way to end the panel. We're approaching the end of our time, so I'll make a brief attempt at summarizing and concluding here. So the internet, it's a material, physical thing that's made up of cables and servers. They transmit content and it also connects us globally. But the internet is not ownerless. Somebody actually owns this stuff, and ownership constitutes power, and this power is growing in concentration. So we are already past the point of dependency on the infrastructures that the global technology providers provide. So we have to start asking how resilient our societies really are to maintain healthy information spaces, particularly when we see increasing unrest and crises. So at what point does this dependency actually compromise national sovereignty, national political and digital and data sovereignties? How do we regulate the space to ensure the conditions for a free and resilient media that actually help to uphold these societies? So I had 3 thoughts on how to maybe offset these dependency problems. The first would be to keep transparency and accountability at the front of every conversation that we have about private as well as public maintenance of digital infrastructures. Second, to regulate the digital infrastructure to make sure that we have universality, human right, and freedom of expression at the base of every decision. And third, to immediately start building alternatives. So with that, I want to thank our keynote speakers, Anja and Chris, very much for your perspectives today, and also to all of our panelists for giving us this rich context. Thank you also to online audiences and you for being here in the room. Thank you.